Our topic tonight, as you know, has to do with bending history, Barack Obama's foreign policy. It's the title of a book which Dr. O'Hanlon has recently written with two of his Brookings colleagues. And I should note that there are copies of it there for sale, and he'd be willing to sign some after the address. There are also copies of Wounded Giant, which is an earlier treatment of the state and condition of today's American military. The use of the term wounded giant is understandable. Most of you know Dr. O'Hanlon either from reading his writings, more than a dozen books written and co-written, a couple thousand interviews on the radio or appearances on television, and several hundred op-ed pieces in our journal's most prominent papers. I was just handed one from the Baltimore Sun, so they appear in many places, and we're most of us have enjoyed his commentaries for a number of years. Dr. O'Hanlon, as many of you know, is a graduate of Princeton University. His A.B. and M.A. degrees are both in the physical sciences. His Ph.D. is in public and international policy. He's also, at this time, he teaches at Princeton as well as an adjunct professor, I believe, or a visiting professor. And I think you're adjunct at Johns Hopkins. But in any case, he enjoyed his time at Princeton. I was struck by the fact that when he went into the Peace Corps in what used to be Zaire, he taught physics both on the college and high school level in French. And one of my stepdaughters went to Swarthmore, and there they used to teach algebra and French for their amusement rather than out of necessity. But in any case, it was an interesting Peace Corps career. He's worked in the Budget Bureau and elsewhere in the government before joining Brookings, where he's been for since the mid-1990s. He presently is a senior fellow. He is director of research in American foreign policy for Brookings. And for those of you who have enjoyed the indices on first Iraq and then Afghanistan and now Pakistan, he's the creator of those. And they've been a marvelous help to a lot of people. They're published regularly in the New York Times for everyone's help. His specializations is, of course, national security policy and American foreign policy. He's written on a wide number of topics: homeland security, the role of the military in space, questions about not just non-proliferation, but doing away with nuclear weapons, a skeptic's view. He's written on Korea, of course, the North Korean nuclear problem, the Taiwan Straits difficulties, and in the past several years been deeply enmeshed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, his writings are impressive. They're widespread. He comes to us with extraordinary knowledge and experience. I should add parenthetically that one of the people I know that he thinks highly of is General Petraeus, who was also a Ph.D. from Princeton in an overlapping period of time, and you now serve on his advisory committee, the out of the agency committee. In any case, he serves the nation well. He writes seriously about our foreign affairs. It's our great pleasure to welcome him this evening. Michael O'Hanlon.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great treat to be here. And Frank, what a wonderful introduction. It's just an amazing experience to come up to Baltimore to spend time with Frank and all of you. And I'm a big admirer of the Baltimore Council and all the energy and intensity and intellect and experience in this room. And so I'm sure we're going to have fun tonight, because the topic and the subject lends itself to some discussion and even potential controversy, and I'll look forward to the fun of the conversation, because what we try to do in the book, Bending History, which is what I'm talking about tonight, is to essentially make sense of and assess Barack Obama's foreign policy so far. And obviously it's an election year, so this is not a strictly academic undertaking. I will acknowledge right up front, let's get everything on the table, that the three authors are all Democrats. but none of them have served in the Obama administration. Two of us were on Hillary's campaign, so we had mixed feelings about Obama's initial success. And moreover, most of all, we're all curmudgeonly scholars who don't like to take any party line, whether it's our own party or the other side or somebody in between. And therefore, I hope the book stands and holds up analytically. You're obviously, if you read through it, not going to agree with everything. There's interpretation. There's subjectivity in the book, but I hope there's not systematic bias. And I hope you'll see that tonight as I try to explain a little bit about the arguments in the book and, more importantly, the way in which the Obama administration has been conducting foreign policy. Now, the goal here is not strictly to think in terms of politics or in terms of contemporary history. We also wanted to help people think through what are the real core challenges facing American foreign policy today, and whoever wins in November, what are the big challenges and issues that the next president or the newly reelected President Obama are going to have to confront. So this book has some politics, it has some recent history, but it's also intended to be really a foreign policy discussion of the United States and its interests around the world and what to do about them. Let me begin by telling you what the title might signify, and some of you probably recognize where the title comes from, either because you're Martin Luther King Jr. fans yourselves, or because you know how much this president is a Martin Luther King Jr. fan. But Martin Luther King said in a couple of speeches back in the mid-'60s that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends in the direction of justice. And the idea here is that you have to be patient, but you have to keep trying to bend, almost like you're forging or shaping metal, the forces of history, because they're hard to move, but they do move. And if you stick with it and if you push and if you concentrate your efforts, even if the initial bend of the arc is slight, over time it can really add up. I'm not saying that's what Barack Obama has managed to accomplish so far, but I am saying that's his goal. And if you don't believe my interpretation of it, and not that I've had the chance to do this myself, but go check out the inscription in the carpet in the Oval Office, because that's where this phrase will be found in Obama's own immediate proximity every day of the year. And so for a president who has to be a pragmatist in many ways, and I'll come back to that because it's a big theme of our book, it can never be forgotten that for him, politics is about vision, it is about hope, and as we get into campaign mode again, everyone who thinks back to what he was saying 4 and 5 years ago will remember, of course, the kinds of slogans and words associated with his campaign and the emphasis on hope and on change. And beyond those kinds of big phraseologies, big words, big slogans that I'm sure you all remember, let me remind you a little bit about some of the specific things he was saying as he campaigned for president. He was saying that he wanted to make a big change in global warming and in American patterns of energy use. And you may recall, and I'll come back to this, but he tried to legislate cap and trade once he was president. But the idea of making energy policy a centerpiece of his presidency to try to wean us away from Persian Gulf oil, which to some extent is happening anyway for reasons beyond his or any other politician's control. God bless fracking. But also is something that he wanted to do more than just that. He wanted to actually change the world's patterns of energy usage so that carbon dioxide would be reduced in the atmosphere. That was a big goal from early on. Another big goal, maybe a little bit more practical, but still extremely ambitious, was to repair the breach with the Islamic world, where he felt that the Bush administration and really the forces of history more generally, and certainly the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and everything that had happened, had put us in a very bad spot. And certainly if you looked at public opinion polling throughout the Middle East as President Bush was in office, not to mention the very politics that gave rise to 9/11 in the first place, which can't be blamed on Bush, but are more generally a function of the politics of the Middle East and the long-standing U.S. relationship with that region, Obama wanted to change all that. And there was some plausibility that he could, as the son of a Kenyan Muslim, as a man brought up in Indonesia, as our first African-American president. The biography of this guy and just who he was and what he represented was inspirational and, hopeful around the world. For those of us on the Clinton campaign, it wasn't quite as hopeful or wasn't quite as helpful. And by the way, I don't want to overstate, my role there was modest. A lot of us think tankers, we have some small little dabbling in politics and get to say we were on some campaign or another. Don't take any of us too seriously, unless you really see the proof. But anyway, I was rooting for Hillary in 07 and 08, and I saw what this guy was able to do with his messages. And I'll never forget the Yes We Can speech, which of course he gave the night he lost the New Hampshire primary to Hillary, and it was one of the most exciting and inspirational speeches I ever heard a politician give. And it did have some sections on foreign policy and how he wanted to not only heal this nation, but heal this world. And so I've mentioned now some of the broad rhetoric, mentioned energy policy, mentioned relations with the broader Islamic world. Remember, he also wanted to establish détente with dictators. And he used to complain that the Bush presidency seemed to force people to pick sides, seemed to demonize and antagonize more than was necessary, and maybe if we would just believe a little bit more in the power of dialogue, we could even have better relations with countries like Iran and North Korea. So détente with dictators was a big part of his early message as well. And I'm not even done because I haven't even gotten to denuclearizing the planet, which was a big goal that he had in the campaign. And as you recall, some of these goals, he often gave a big speech once he was president in that first year in particular. So on nuclear denuclearization, or the elimination of all nuclear weapons globally, he gave a big speech in Prague in April of 2009, reiterating that goal. On relations with the Islamic world, he gave a big speech, of course, in Cairo in June of 2009, trying to articulate that same vision. To some extent, that speech has entered into the political dialogue now because for a lot of Republicans, it's become one example of how Obama apologizes too much for America. I actually do agree with some of the critiques of President Obama, but not that one. I don't think that one holds up, and I'll come back to that if you like in a minute. But in any event, he had a number of speeches early in his presidency which tried to pick up on some of these themes from the campaign trail. And then there was another big one. And here I think my former Brookings colleague, Susan Rice, who's now, of course, our UN ambassador, and a very capable and very impressive woman who's, I think, done great work there. But she advocated during the campaign, along with a few others, that he give a speech on global poverty. And this speech, which was, I think, August 2007 at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, called for a doubling of foreign aid. Now, that was before the financial crisis and the huge deficits, or at least before the trillion-dollar deficits. But nonetheless, that was just one more idea that almost seemed to flow naturally from this guy's worldview. But the last president to seriously take a crack at doubling U.S. foreign aid, actually George W. Bush did better on this than most people remember, but it was really John F. Kennedy. And that sort of more, indicative of Obama's appeal and the message and the inspiration that he tried to conjure up in general. I think he probably did as much as anybody since Kennedy. I would argue he even tried to raise our sights bigger and higher than Ronald Reagan, who was also a very good speaker. But Reagan's rhetoric, I think, just trying to be analytical about it, was a little more focused on traditional American values, traditional American goals of foreign policy, standing up to communism, strong defense. Reagan's message was not quite as all-encompassing about changing the world. He was more about dealing with the immediacy of the Soviet threat and the Cold War. Obama had this extremely expansive vision. And so that's what's striking as you begin to assess this president and look at him and try to make sense of who he was in his own mind. And we did a few interviews for the book. We tried to get to the president himself, and we were unsuccessful, I'm afraid to report. I did have an interview with the vice president. We had a couple of interviews with some speechwriters, and one of them said, and maybe it was self-serving, but I actually think it was a reflection of some realities he had learned the hard way. If you want to understand what this president thinks, read his speeches, because he really means what he puts in his speeches. Because we in the speechwriting department know how many times he corrects the stuff that we put in, and sometimes we wish he would just read the thing and get it done, but he takes every single word seriously. And so these visionary speeches, whether on the campaign trail or early in the presidency, mattered a lot to Obama and really did reflect his true thinking. But it's obviously not that simple, because as the book underscores, what we saw about the president as he took office was a number of very pragmatic steps. And some people will interpret these as, all the campaign rhetoric was clearly cynical. He didn't really mean the big visionary stuff. Some people will say he had to learn the hard way. Some people will say the vision was still there, but he had to deal with his inbox as it came before him. There's probably something to a fair amount of these kinds of interpretations, some blend of them. But let me remind you of how quickly he changed his approach as he became President of the United States. In his inaugural address itself, he said, "We will reach out a hand to those who would unclench their own fist," talking about North Korea and Iran, I think, specifically. And in the campaign, he didn't use such conditional language. In the campaign, he was more apt to try to win, an election, to point out that the George W. Bush and maybe even a potential John McCain form of diplomacy was not very helpful and had antagonized and deepened these problems with rogue states and dictators more than was necessary. And he, Obama, was going to try a whole new form of diplomacy, and paraphrasing the old Kennedy line that we need not negotiate out of fear, but we should not fear to negotiate. And that was the rhetoric we heard on the campaign trail. As he becomes president, about 15 minutes after he's taken the oath of office, he is changing ever so slightly, but in a very important way, the formulation, and reminding people, now that he's president, that as he presumably knew all along, even if George W. Bush didn't do things perfectly, it was really Ahmadinejad and Kim Jong-il who were the main problem, which we sort of all knew all along anyway, but it had not become central in Obama's rhetoric until he was president. Then, what else did he do in these early days? He kept Bob Gates as Secretary of Defense. It's so obvious to us now. Everybody tends to think highly of Bob Gates. I certainly do. Most of you probably do. He's a pragmatic guy. He came out of the intelligence community. It's not as if he was some big partisan ideologue, but it's still stunning. Do you know how many times in our nation's history a new president, when he took office from a president of the previous party, had kept the previous guy's Secretary of Defense? Zero. It had never happened before. The only time a Secretary of Defense was retained from one president to the next is after the Kennedy assassination, when McNamara stayed. It's the only previous time. And here Obama had campaigned against Bush and Cheney with enthusiasm and relish, and talked about how much he regretted that Dick Cheney was his cousin, and why couldn't he have somebody cool as a cousin, like George Clooney, or somebody, some of the lines he used to use on the campaign trail. And then what does he do? Now, admittedly, it wasn't Rumsfeld, it was Gates, but nonetheless, he kept the Secretary of Defense of the president he had just replaced after campaigning very hard against that president's legacy. Now, again, it sort of all makes sense to us now, but this was not what people would have predicted in advance, certainly not what Gates expected in advance. Then what did he do? He convened big reviews for foreign policy on two pressing issues, not global warming and denuclearization of the planet and foreign aid and global poverty, but Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he had separate working groups. And again, Iraq had been a big problem in his mind for the country for a long time. Iraq had been a source of huge partisan debate during the campaign. And Obama had said he was going to get out of Iraq with our main combat units within 16 months of becoming president. There were actually times where he said he'd do it even faster than that, because he sometimes said, I'll get 1 to 2 brigades out per month. And he inherited about 16 brigades, which means that he could have been out by that formulation in 12 months. But what did he do? He had the review, and then he decided to take 19 months, and after the 19 months, to leave 6 brigades in Iraq. Now, politicians have to be allowed a little bit of way to talk themselves, into a different position. I think Obama was basically consistent with the spirit of his campaign promise, but he redesignated those 6 combat brigades as advise and assist brigades. Those of you with military background, you'll appreciate, and I think some of you know, that those advise and assist brigades did not look that different from combat brigades. Nobody insisted on sending the tanks home. These brigades were not passing out Girl Scout cookies as their main preoccupation. They did have a few more advisors and a few less infantry than a typical brigade. They were sort of a concoction of the Army designed to support this particular change in mission, but they were there for their firepower. And so Obama kept 50,000 U.S. troops in Iraq for 3 years after becoming president. And as you know, they left only this past December. And that last group stayed pretty much intact until the fall of 2011. Very pragmatic, not ideological, not exactly the policies you might have predicted listening to him on the campaign trail. Then he had this big Afghanistan review. And on Afghanistan, he did do more or less what he had said, except he sort of doubled and tripled and quadrupled his initial bets, because what he had said on the campaign trail is Afghanistan was always the right war. It was always the war we should have been fighting with greater focus and intensity and resources. And he said, as candidate, I'm probably going to add 2 brigades. And back in 2008, as you recall, that was sort of the number that was kicking around in the Pentagon and what John McCain wanted to do as well. There was no huge controversy to it. Obama did sort of help lead the debate, but he was not way ahead of anybody else in terms of the numbers of added forces. And as you know, a brigade has 3,500 to 4,000 soldiers, but you add the support on top of that, it's about, again, as much. And so you're talking sort of 15,000 people, roughly, that Obama was implicitly saying he was going to add to the Afghanistan mission. When he took office, the Afghanistan mission was around 30,000, 35,000 Americans. Well, as you know, he ultimately went up to 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. So he didn't just add 2 brigades, he added 8 brigades. And only now in the last few months has that begun to decline. As you know, you may know, we're at 90,000 U.S. troops right now. We're going to be at 68,000 by the end of September. That will have sort of ended the second big increment of forces that Obama approved in his West Point speech of 2009. And then after that, we don't yet know what the drawdown will be. But the administration's been clear that there will be no further discussion of additional drawdowns until this one is over. And that's language that Obama and more specifically General Allen were very clear about 2 weeks ago for the first time. And so again, you're seeing a hawkishness. Or the phrase that I like to use to summarize maybe 80% of what I think the president's been doing in office, I describe it as a reluctant realism. In other words, he wanted to be a visionary. He still wants to be a visionary. He still wants to bend history in the direction of justice, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, but he knows he has to deal with his inbox first, partly because he's a very serious student of world politics and world affairs, partly, I'm sure, because he knows what happened to his immediate predecessors in the Democratic Party with national security issues when they became president, starting in the modern times, arguably, with Kennedy, certainly with Johnson, certainly with Carter, and then in the initial 2 or 3 years with Bill Clinton. And Obama knew that he couldn't have the same mistakes, especially as the nation's first black president, especially as the supposedly most liberal member of the U.S. Senate, according to some of the evaluation methods that were used the year before. The last thing he could afford was to be seen as some person who didn't really care about being a tough leader of the United States and its military forces. But I don't think it was just politics. I think that, as we've seen with his pursuit of al-Qaeda, he's a pretty tough guy and probably a pretty resolute guy. And probably an appealing guy. The individuals I know who work with him and for him tend to like him. But I don't think they think of him as some pushover nice guy. I think this is a pretty steely person. And so I don't think it was that much of a leap or a change from what we've seen in doing this book for him to become a reluctant realist. So I've gone through some of these initial decisions, some of these initial policies, especially on the wars. Let me mention a couple more, and I don't want to take too long because there's so much to talk about. It'll be more fun to do it in the form of discussion. But we're also hearing now on the campaign trail of 2012 that Obama mishandled Iran and North Korea. His hopes were too high. He went into office with big dreams about what he could accomplish in this détente process with dictators. And frankly, I was a critic of his thinking in 2007, 2008 as well. And as a friend of Hillary, even wrote about why I did not think that negotiating with dictators was going to be very successful, and why I thought there was even some potential harm in wasting our national rhetoric and our national dialogue of 2007, 2008 on this pretty outlandish hope that somehow a kinder America, a kinder negotiator in the White House would all of a sudden melt the ice inside of Iran and North Korea and maybe other places too. But I got to give Obama credit. What happened is, I think, that in the first 6 months of his presidency, he kept hope alive that he could turn things around with Iran and North Korea. And maybe he was a little naive, maybe he was a little too hopeful. But then 2 things happened that changed his mind. The Iranian leadership stole its presidential election on June 12, 2009, and of course suppressed and brutalized its own population in the process. And the North Koreans, a couple months before that, in April 2009, tested their second nuclear weapon. And I could have told them, to those North Koreans, don't get my friend Susan Rice mad. She's a wonderful person, but if you give her a reason to come after you, like I did on the surge when I supported the surge in Iraq, and she disagreed with me. I'm teasing here, but she did a masterful job at the UN, leading an international coalition-building process to tighten sanctions on North Korea and on Iran after these huge brutalizations of their own people, these huge violations of international law. And what the world saw, I believe, was that Obama really had tried. He really had tried to get along with Iran. He really had tried to get along with North Korea. And they rejected his outstretched hand, almost as if they were afraid of it. In fact, I think they might have been. I think they actually both realized they do better in antagonistic relationships with the United States than they might in conciliatory relationships. Because once you start down that path of reform and cooperation, sometimes it's hard to control, if you're an extremist regime, how far that goes. And your own population may start to wonder why they're supporting this hardline regime if you start to get along with a country like the United States. I think Iran and North Korea were sort of afraid of Obama and afraid of his friendship, in a sense. And when the world saw that Iran and North Korea reacted in this way, it became possible for Susan and Hillary and the rest of Obama's team to really lead an international effort to tighten the sanctions on these two countries, such that you might say Barack Obama wound up pursuing George Bush's agenda better than Bush himself could. And again, I say that with respect for the Bush administration. They did a lot of important things towards Iran and North Korea. People like Stuart Levy at Treasury really helped with a lot of the banking restrictions that were done to some extent in a complementary way to the UN process in that period of time under Bush. So it was building on a previous record, but in some ways Obama was much better positioned to pursue it because he wasn't seen as this unilateralist American leader who was somehow trying to impose his own will on the rest of the world. And I don't say that out of any disdain for George W. Bush. I think Bush's motives on most of these issues were pretty good, and he got a bad rap. But the fact is he did get a bad rap internationally, and he was seen as pursuing a unilateralist American agenda in dealing with some of these particular cases I'm referring to, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and that led to some pushback. A lot of countries didn't want to go along with Bush. Either they worried that if they supported him, he would wind up doing another invasion, or that they'd be serving an agenda that was concocted and cooked up in Washington that the rest of the world was simply expected to fall in line behind. Obama's diplomacy on these questions has been, I think, more effective. Let me do a quick tangent to just, again, make sure that I try to be fair here. I think George W. Bush did a much better job in Asia, in the big countries of Asia, than people generally remember or acknowledge. And certainly our relations with China, with Japan for much of the presidency of Bush, with India, went a long ways under our previous president. And I think George W. Bush deserves more credit than that. So in a way, the campaign of 2007, 2008 oversimplified the problem. Obama was right that our standing had really fallen dramatically in the broader Middle East and in Europe, but it actually had not fallen in Asia. And so, by the way, I'll come back to this in a second, Obama has had a great deal of trouble sustaining the improvement in our relations in the broader Middle East that he initially benefited from and initially helped catalyze, but he's sort of lost ground and fallen back to sort of George W. Bush-like popularity levels in the broader Middle East, which is fairly stunning and difficult as a reality for us to cope with. But let me now move to a couple other issues. I did talk about China. And here I think George W. Bush did a pretty good job, but in general in the region in East Asia, if there was one critique of the Bush administration that tended to stick, it was that the Americans, yeah, they had good personal diplomacy, Bush with Prime Minister Koizumi in Japan, or Bush with the Chinese or Indians, but the Americans always seemed a little preoccupied by what was happening 3,000 or 4,000 miles to the west of East Asia, in Iraq, in Iran, in Afghanistan. And what Obama was able to do was to sort of change the tenor of the dialogue. Now, initially, that didn't work. In the first year, Obama was seen by the Chinese as being weak, irresolute, maybe even also a combination of those things with a little too cunning and clever, because he seemed to want to lure the Chinese into a new partnership to help deal with big issues like global warming. And you all recall the Copenhagen summit of December 2009, where Bush was trying to team up initially with, or Obama trying to team up with the Chinese to do some big dramatic things. The Chinese weren't so sure they liked all this stuff, though, because they suspected sort of an American plot, that we were trying to ask them to help run the world before they were ready. We were expecting them to contribute more financial aid and other things to other countries before they had really developed their own country. And this was actually sort of a diabolical American plan to slow down their development. And I think to some extent they believed it. And Ken Lieberthal writes very powerfully of this in chapter 2 in our book in particular. But Obama, therefore, got into some trouble with the Chinese in 2009. And then, as you recall, the Chinese themselves were doing some fairly assertive things in their region. They were sailing boats through Japanese territorial waters. They said to the United States, we better not sail aircraft carriers in the Yellow Sea anymore, even though it was out in international waterways. They started telling Vietnam and the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries that they were going to impose their own control of the South China Sea and claim it even more unambiguously than before as Chinese territorial waters. And all this stuff set Obama and Clinton and Gates and Panetta up for a counter push. So again, you saw the reluctant realism of Barack Obama come to the fore. In this case, more like in 2010. And what he did was he started doing big summitry, big delegations or coordinated visits by his cabinet and by himself to East Asia, shoring up our alliances, making it clear we were there to stay, making it clear our friends should not feel pushed around by the Chinese, making it clear that our military forces were not going to be reduced in Asia, even if our defense budget had to come down somewhat, given our deficit situation. And this happened, as you know, in 2010 and then into the fall of 2011 as well. Very concentrated push, made our allies feel a lot better, really gave the message that the United States was focused on Asia even more than it had been under George W. Bush, because now we were focused more on Asia on its own terms. We weren't just asking for Asia to partner with us to deal with terrorism. We were trying to reinsert ourselves in issues like disputes between China and its neighbors over territory. And this was, again, a pretty pragmatic, pretty tough-edged approach towards foreign policy. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff where Obama's been successful. His reluctant realism, his toughness, his pragmatism, knowing that he had to handle that inbox, knowing that he could not be seen as the next Jimmy Carter or even Bill Clinton, who had a tough first 2 or 3 years in foreign policy. But let me say a few things about where I think the president's had some problems and where his remaining challenges certainly lie. First of all, even though he's handled most of these specific issues pretty darn well, there have been a couple of specific cases where he did not. Exhibit A has to be the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and Martin Indyk writes about this in a sort of a devastating way in our book, and it's almost like reading a Shakespeare tragedy, because I'm sure you remember pieces of this history, and Martin tells it, knows it so well. But I'll just give you one example to remind you of some of the things that happened. In September of 2010, President Obama, having been frustrated by the progress or lack thereof with the peace process so far, went to the UN and gave his annual speech to the General Assembly at the time of year when all the heads of state show up for that. And he talked about how wouldn't it be nice if next year, when we reconvene in September of 2011, we can welcome an independent Palestine as the newest member of the United Nations. This was something Barack Obama chose to raise as a possibility and make a centerpiece of his 2010 speech. Do you recall what happened in 2011? He himself had to lead the charge to threaten a veto of a resolution that would do exactly what he had set out as a goal in 2010. In other words, the United States, having laid out this vision and encouraged everyone else to rally behind it, the way it then played out diplomatically over the 12 months that followed made it unacceptable to the United States, because the Palestinians were just going to go declare nationhood without a peace deal. And they were going to do it with the help of a lot of Arab states and other countries, and Obama could not live with that. So he had to go from being the idea's #1 advocate to threatening a veto of the exact same idea, admittedly expressed in different terms, and achieved through different means that Obama felt made it unacceptable. But what a horrible position for the United States to have to find itself in. And I'm not saying that Netanyahu and the Palestinians would have made peace if President Obama had done everything correctly. But the way in which we not only failed to get the parties to move forward, but drag down our own reputation in the process was striking. And the president made some flat-out mistakes. He didn't listen enough to advisors on this issue. He had too much confidence in his own interpretation of what drove the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and he acted on those instincts at times when his advisors were waving their hands and saying, please listen, this approach isn't going to work. But his confidence in his own judgment was such that he went ahead with an approach that really dragged down not just the peace process, but America's standing throughout the broader Islamic world, I'm afraid. On energy policy, the Copenhagen Accord of December 2009 was itself, I guess you could say, relatively harmless, relatively non-binding, and in the end, not any great acrimony resulted from the deal. But then Obama tried to follow up with legislation in the Congress the following spring that would have reduced American carbon emissions by 17%, or about a sixth, by 2020, and then by 83% by 2050. And of course, that 83% number is extremely ambitious, but it was designed to be far enough out there that the market could respond. And as you know, cap and trade basically is designed to create market incentives for people finding alternative sources of energy, because there's a tax essentially on carbon, and the tax goes up with time, and that's the way the mechanism works. Well, without retelling the whole story of what happened there, I think President Obama had a questionable approach to begin with, because this cap and trade idea was so ambitious that I think it conjured up fears of big government in the eyes of a lot of the Republicans that until then he had been hoping to work with. And I'm not defending the Republicans in Congress. I think many of them had a deliberately obstructionist policy towards this president. But to the extent there was some hope to get some Republicans aboard some of his major ideas, and I won't talk health care tonight because it's not within my area of expertise, but on energy policy, the idea of cap and trade is an enormously transformative way to think about our energy economy. And Obama, to some extent, tried a mechanism for adopting this change that was almost too sophisticated and too clever for a lot of people to understand, and then he let Congress take the lead on it, and meanwhile a lot of Americans were wondering what it really meant and how it would work. And then when they tried to cut deals with a lot of key Republicans like Lindsey Graham, they just botched the congressional deal-making. And we didn't do a lot of original research on this, but we certainly investigated and compiled some very good work by others. And generally speaking, on climate policy, I think the president has fallen far short of his own expectations. Now, this does raise the broad question of how much does it even matter if you fall short of expectations? So what if you give out a big vision, the whole world buys into it, a lot of Americans are fired up about it, but then you come into office and you have to pursue a much more practical, near-term, security-oriented agenda. Well, maybe in some cases it doesn't matter. And as I mentioned, with Iran, North Korea, and China, it might even have helped, because it suggested that this president wanted to turn a new page, and when these other countries would not do so, it made it easier for the United States to mobilize a legitimate consensus around the rest of the world that we needed to get tough. So in that sense, maybe there was no harm done. But on issues like energy policy, the president contributed to his own changing image in American politics as a big government tax and spend guy, because the plan was so audacious that even though it was not technically a tax, it would have translated into much higher costs for carbon-emitting fuels or carbon-based fuels. And ultimately, therefore, it helped contribute to the way in which his opposition depicted him, fairly or not, as a big government liberal. So if you think about the two charges that are always used against Democrats, one of them is they're soft on national security. Obama dealt with that one, and he knocked it out of the ballpark, in my opinion. He was pretty robust on American national security, and I haven't spent even that much time talking about what he did to bin Laden or al-Awlaki or al-Qaeda leadership in general. But on the issue of supposedly being a tax and spend liberal, I don't think the president is a tax and spend liberal, but his image certainly has become largely intertwined with that set of constructs and images. And it's going to be very hard for him, I think, in his re-election bid to overcome that. So there's a personal domestic liability. Also, I mentioned in the broader Islamic world, there's a huge sense of disappointment that this president has not delivered. And as Martin Indyk, my co-author and my boss, so I'll be especially kind here, but as he, also the former ambassador to Israel, as he points out, you know, it's one thing for an American president to sort of show he can be tough vis-a-vis Israel, and that's what Obama tried to do early on with the settlements issue, and he tried to draw a line. He said, but, you know, Arab partners in peace, they don't necessarily care if we are tough on Israel. They expect us to bring Israel along. They expect us to give Israel the confidence and the prodding to make specific compromises. That's what they care about, because only we can do it. Of course, Israelis are the ones who have to do it, but in terms of international partners, only the United States has any real leverage with Israel at the peace table. A lot of countries have leverage or interactions with the Arab world, and that's a big community to begin with. But the United States has a special relationship, obviously, with Israel. And if you want peace process talks to succeed, the role of the United States that is indispensable is that we build enough confidence in our Israeli friends that they will listen to us when we ask them to make tough choices. Now, maybe Netanyahu wouldn't have done that with any American president, but he certainly was not going to do it with Obama, when Obama's initial goals were to essentially pressure Netanyahu and go after a lot of his right-wing coalition on the settlements issue. And then when Obama's standing, even throughout the broader Israeli public, really plummeted to terrible levels in that first year, year and a half. It's begun to recover. But here's another example of where the big expectations, if they're not realized, can actually create a really unfortunate fallout that's greater than if you had never raised the expectations in the first place. So, you know, why don't I finish my sort of overview of the world with that, but I do want to now raise the big issue on which we conclude the book. And I think it's going to be the central challenge for either a re-elected Barack Obama or for a newly elected Governor Romney or Sarah Palin or whoever else comes out of the brokered convention, and or Ralph Nader, who knows. But I think the next American president, and this is sort of saying the obvious, but the connection isn't always made to foreign policy, and we try to do it in the book at the end. The next American president cannot have a successful foreign policy without economic renewal at home. And the reason we say this is not just because we all hate the notion of trillion-dollar deficits and so on, and because we're all a little bit nervous about whether our kids and our grandkids are going to have as good of a life as we did, and the fear that the American dream is sort of stalling, and that our best days may be behind us, and all of that, which is bad enough just to think about in terms of our domestic economy and the fabric of our own domestic society. But it also has huge international implications. And so we chose to emphasize this in our book's conclusion as the central foreign policy challenge for the United States. Ken Lieberthal, who is the third guy on our team and the China scholar, as I mentioned, was the one who really sensitized Martin and me to this even more than perhaps we had been before. Because he said, listen, I'm spending a lot of time in China, and the Chinese already think that we're in decline, that they're rising a lot faster than they previously had expected themselves, that the American model has been largely discredited, not just by our inability to save, not just by our supposed softness as a democracy, but also by the financial crisis and what that proved. The Americans can't even do finance better than the rest of the world. We thought that was the one thing they were still better at, apart from Madonna's music, and it turns out they can't even get that right. And Madonna's even getting old. So, so when you put it all together, the Chinese have this image of the United States as yesterday's power. And to some extent, there's legitimacy to that view. Now, what we argue in the book is it's certainly not too late. And those of you who, you're from a great city, you know that there are great universities in a place like this. There are great high-tech industry. The Chinese have not overtaken us in high-tech. The Chinese have not overtaken us in education. Our demographics, I think, are much more favorable than theirs. We have a nice, slowly growing population in a big chunk of land. They've got a huge population, which is now beginning to shrink because of their one-child policy, which was a necessary adjustment because of the huge size of their population, on a landmass that's about the same size as ours, but frankly not as well endowed on balance, and increasingly polluted and overrun with a number of problems. And I don't want to make this all about a U.S.-China competition. There are a lot of other changing dynamics in the world as well. But they do all tend to come together around this notion that the United States cannot continue to lead as a great power if we don't show the world that our economic trajectory is robust. Does that mean that we have to get rid of our deficit completely? No. But it does mean, and does it mean that we have to always stay ahead of China in GDP? Not necessarily. I'm not sure that's even possible if we look out 20, 30, 40 years. Although the Chinese have, again, their fair share of problems too. But I do think the coalition we lead of Western countries, primarily democracies, largely Europe, but also increasingly Latin America, also increasingly parts of South Asia, this coalition, if we lead it correctly, can easily outcompete with Russia or China or any other specific power that wants to set its own way and wants to potentially be antagonistic towards us. But we can't do that if the rest of that coalition sees us as a weakening power. The American public will not support big enough defense budgets to stay globally engaged. The American public will not support enough foreign assistance to keep our diplomats able to do things in the field that are necessary to help countries like Egypt turn around. The United States will not be able to lower trade barriers because there'll be too much sense at home that we got to protect whatever jobs we still have. And so many of the mechanisms, many of the patterns of behavior that led us to the great position in the world that we have today will be put at risk. And there's just no way to sustain where we are with trillion-dollar-a-year deficits. Now, I'm not blaming the president so much for those deficits. I think he deserves some of the blame. I would personally blame Congress a little more, although it's always unfair when you compare the executive to the Congress because everybody can blame Congress. It's 535 people of different parties, different parts of the country, and they do a lot of stuff behind closed doors, and the president's just one person leading an executive branch. But nonetheless, having said that, whether you want to blame primarily Eric Cantor or Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi or Barack Obama, the president rises and falls politically and in the history books based on what was going on in our country on his watch. Barack Obama is president partly because the economy tanked on George W. Bush's watch, and therefore John McCain, by being a Republican, was associated with that. So in a sense, in politics terms, the president had some good fortune in 2008, and now he's got some bad fortune, which is that this economic slump turns out to be pretty hard to get out of. But if he can't do it, he will, on balance, I would predict, have a foreign policy that will not be seen as successful by historians. So let's say, for the sake of argument, he wins re-election, or let's say Governor Romney wins. Either one of them is going to have to make a meaningful dent in our economic trajectory, or we are going to be seen historically as in a period of decline. And this period, even if we managed a few problems okay here and there, will be a period in which our star was dimming in the history books. And that is a central challenge that I think, for one thing, and I will finish here on a little bit of a note of criticism of the president, because I think I've given on balance a fairly positive view, and we do in the book. We think he's done a fairly good job on foreign policy. But I'm just going to bring it to a head with one very specific and topical observation. If you agree with what I just said, I won't speak for you, but I had some problems with the president's speech yesterday because I thought it was very confrontational. And I think that I don't like Paul Ryan's budget. I would never vote for it in 100 years. But I respect the fact that Ryan's prepared to say some things people don't want to hear to get the deficit down. What I would like to do is build on Ryan's courage, throw away his plan, and build a better plan, but in the spirit of recognizing that we do have an obligation to successive generations. So I think Obama thinks very much in terms of fairness right now. And that's a legitimate perspective. But Republican friends, and I say as a Democrat, I know a lot of you are Republicans, a lot of you are Democrats, but Republican friends these days are speaking more in generational fairness terms. And that's legitimate. And we got to stop demonizing the other side just because they're emphasizing one part of the argument or the other. So in my opinion, I will be disappointed if Governor Romney and President Obama go after each other the next 7 months the way they have been the last 24 hours. It's not what our country needs. We're going to need some bipartisan compromise. And that's one more lesson of this presidency, as well as things have gone overall, that bipartisanship has been elusive, and a man who wanted to be a post-partisan president, whether it was his fault or not, has not accomplished that goal either. So it's a mixed, very interim assessment, more favorable than not, but with some big challenges ahead for this president or his successor. And I assume I probably provoked a couple of possible reactions and comments, so let me stop there and please field your thoughts.
Well, we thank you for what is clearly a broad-ranging and I think comprehensive treatment of the President's policy, and with the tone of statesmanship at the end, which we also appreciate very much. The floor is now open for questions. Mr. Smore. I think the question is, how do we solve the Middle East problem?
It's a good point for me to say, please buy and read the book, because Martin Indyk did more on this than I, and you'll get a full dose of his thinking. But seriously, I would also say, and let me start indirectly, on the Arab awakenings. And I'm very impressed, although not surprised, that you're going to have Ambassador Ford here in a few weeks' time. I may have to drive up for that one myself if I can sneak an invitation. But I think that what's going on with the Arab awakenings in general is a part of the Obama legacy that we talk about in the book, and generally, so far, reasonably favorably, because some people describe this period or this set of issues as a set of issues where the president led from behind. It was sort of an unfortunate phraseology that some anonymous White House staffer supposedly used with a New Yorker magazine journalist. But in fact, Obama did the right thing, I believe, on balance, with most of the Arab revolutions, because he realized that if he tried to get in front of them and push too hard, that he would delegitimize the very forces of reform that he was hoping to encourage. And also, at some point, he did have to say to Mubarak, you got to step down, because there was no way to keep the guy in power any longer. It took Obama a few days to get there, but I think he basically read most of those revolutions pretty well. This doesn't resolve what to do about Syria today, and it doesn't resolve the Arab-Israeli peace process. I don't know what you can do at the moment. I don't have a great solution. I think we're back to damage control, and you may have to wait for, of course, a lot of the conversation now in the Middle East is about when and if Israel strikes Iran and its nuclear facilities. So the peace process is not getting a huge amount of attention at the moment. And I'm afraid I hope it's okay if I just admit that I don't really have a good answer to your question. But I think what you have to do is stay in damage control mode, and you support the reformist Palestinians in the meantime with economic help, with diplomatic engagement, elevating the stature of them whenever you can, and you play for time and you wait for an opportunity. One more thing Martin wrote in his previous book is in the Middle East, sometimes you just got to pound away at an issue for 10 or 20 years and be ready for that 6-month window of opportunity. We waited too long in certain past periods to act on that kind of window. I don't think we have it right now, but we got to get ready for it the next time.
Would you comment on the role of Hillary Clinton in our foreign policy, and whether she is, and the degree to which she is in fact a leader?
I think she's been a good Secretary of State, but I probably wouldn't give her primary credit for framing Obama's foreign policy worldview. In fact, we were struggling in the book to come up with it because, as you heard me say tonight, there were big ambitions on the campaign trail, and then that translated largely into a reluctant realism in the White House. And on places where he did have a big vision, like energy policy or Arab-Israeli peace, it didn't always work out. And to some extent, he didn't listen very well to advisors, including Hillary, on those questions. Hillary did have a lot to do, I believe, with East Asia and China policy. I give her and Kurt Campbell, her Assistant Secretary for Asia, a lot of credit. The White House has also done a good job on Asia. They've really worked as a team. On balance, though, there were other issues like our policy towards Russia, where I think the White House really took the lead. And I think overall they've made some modest progress, which is probably as much as they could have realistically hoped for. And I would give the White House more credit there, just as I would give the White House most of the blame for the failure on the Israeli-Palestinian front. So the way we describe it in the book is that Obama had about as competent of a couple of people to manage his foreign policy problems as he could have possibly found with Gates and Clinton. But they really were themselves pragmatists. And Hillary Clinton certainly known for a lot of big ideals and visions in her own life, but I think as Secretary of State, she really turned into just a workhorse. You know, she's extremely diligent, extremely hardworking, really has learned her briefs and her portfolio on a lot of different issues. I've only gotten to interact with her a couple of times since she's been secretary, but always been very impressed. And that's an incredibly demanding job, too, because of the sheer amount of jet lag. I mean, that's just a brutal job. So I give her a lot of credit, but I'm not sure I go quite so far as to say that she's been the primary visionary. I think Obama's kept that role to himself. Interesting point, he has had, and I respect them, they're competent, they're good, but relatively lower stature national security advisors in the White House. So he hasn't had anything close to a Kissinger or a Scowcroft to rival, some previous presidents. He's had lower key, process-oriented national security advisors, Jim Jones, Tom Donnellan, as well as their deputies and others in the White House, partly because he's trusted his own brain to provide the vision. And that's sometimes been good, but he's sometimes made mistakes with that approach.
Would you justify saying that Afghanistan was the right war, is the right war, and justify more troops there?
Yeah. There are a couple of aspects to this. And in a sense, you both asked the questions, two different questions. Was it the right war, and is it a war that, now that we're in it this far, that we should be careful in how we get out? If you don't mind, I'm just going to take the second. We have 90,000 U.S. troops left. We've spent already about $500 billion there. If we were to accelerate our drawdown and just basically say, mission accomplished, bin Laden's dead, let's go home, or mission impossible, Karzai can't be worked with, let's get the heck out. Either one of those two approaches leads to a war with, because it'll take a while to get out, even if we hurry it up, $600 billion in American expenditure and 2,200 dead Americans. If, however, we stay on the campaign plan that's pretty well thought through by General Allen and others, which still gets us mostly out by 2014, then we spend $700 billion, and maybe we lose 2,400 Americans, but the Afghan state probably survives. So I look at it at this point, and I've been a supporter of the mission, so I acknowledge that, and it hasn't worked out as well as I hoped, and I'll acknowledge that too. But at this point, the logic of trying to improve the East, the way we already have improved the South, North, West, and Center, to me is fairly compelling in arguing for a gradual drawdown. I've encouraged my friends in the military to explain what they're doing more in these kind of geographic terms. People say, a lot of Americans love to read about World War II or watch war movies because there was a logical sequence. You could follow the flag move, the front line move on the map. Actually, you can do it in counterinsurgency to some extent, too. Because in 2010 and 2011, under McChrystal and Petraeus, we really focused on Kandahar and Helmand. Those places are about 50% less violent. They are increasingly governed by Afghans. Probably 60 to 70% of all operations in those parts of the country are now led by Afghan forces. Kabul, the capital, is safer than many capital cities in this hemisphere in terms of statistical incidents of crime. And the Afghan forces secure it. We don't do much to help them. The North and the West are not as good as they used to be 10 years ago, but they're better than they were a year or two ago, and they're not getting worse any longer. So that leaves the East. And it also leaves us to complete the buildup of the Afghan army and police. By this fall, they will have reached their full intended size. By the end of 2013, they will have had a year of extra partnering in the field, sort of apprenticeship with American forces. I want to stay patient through that next couple of years. So we'll debate for a long time whether this war was worth it. But I think given where we are, we should be gradual and careful in how we draw down and not just pull the plug.
It's been an absolutely marvelous evening. Michael, we thank you so much.
Thank you all.